So now we're going to move on from talking about what to do about the h-pawn on the king side if it's pushed, and how weak it is. And now we're going to go on to talking about two more things. One, how to create weaknesses in your opponent's king side. And two, the fact that the king side needs pieces to help defend, because otherwise it's very weak. And believe it or not, it is. So you're going to have to see this. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and the Roy Lopez with f5. A very bold attempt to seize the initiative. Now here, the best move is knight to c3, just simply protecting the pawn. Because here, d4 was played, and obviously the person playing white did not see it. It loses a pawn, and here's how. Take, the knight has to move. After knight takes, take, and c6. So you may ask, why would you do this worthless pawn push? Well, for one, he has to drive off the bishop in order to move the d-pawn. So now that's accomplished. Two, the time lost in moving this pawn is going to be regained when the bishop has to move away. The third reason is because now the queen can come out, give a check, and the fourth reason, he wins the e-pawn. So now bishop moves back, queen a5 check, knight c3, queen takes, and now, actually, when the bishop moved away, bishop to e2 is probably the best move, because even though it looks passive, there needs to be some defense on the king side. When the king castles now, there's nothing there. An attack can come now. So after d5, again, the bishop has the option to move to e2. However, it doesn't, and it moves back. So, even though bishop to e2 looks passive, it's probably the best move because now there's a piece on the king side that can stop attacks. So now, the bishop moves away, knight to f6, and this is how you attack the king. Alright? It's a very hard formula to remember. Develop pieces to good squares where they're useful, and then use them. Aim them towards the king, but develop the pieces to good squares. And knight to f6 is a good square for the knight. And now, white tries to dislodge the queen with an attempt to play bishop to d4 or queen to d4 and get the queen out of the center. However, black is one step ahead. Bishop to d6. This is how you create a permanent weakness. Now, a permanent weakness is one that is permanent, of course, such as a pawn move. So, pushing a pawn in the center, like g3, is a permanent weakness. Now, h3 and especially f3 are weakened because of the absence of the g2 pawn. And it's actually forced. Black forced that weakness because of the mate threat. If anything, like f4, e takes, queen check, king f2, bishop to g4, wins the queen. And that is not a good option to lose a queen. So black tries to play g3, which is the only other option. Now, bishop to g4. So this is called penetration. Black is going for the holes in the position, which a hole is a square where a pawn cannot attack it, such as f3 and h3. No pawn can come in and push out the piece. So, this bishop is aiming for f3. So the queen moves away, and now bishop to f3. So why not bishop to h3? Well, the reason is because after bishop to h3, now the rook can just move to e1, let's say, and now the queen has to come in to f5, and then f3. And now the white queen, though, can stop it with queen to e2. And that's why he places a bishop there, because the queen is not going to come to e2 here. So this is the second step of penetration. Use the holes, or outposts, which they're also called, and place pieces on them. So now, bishop to f4, and bishop to f5. Now this is, of course, the right move, because if bishop takes bishop, queen to h3, mate is unstoppable. So the bishop cannot be taken. The only move here that saves white from immediate checkmate is knight to d1, looking at e3. Queen to h3, and now knight to e3, stopping the checkmate for now. However, that beautifully placed knight on f6 moves up to g4. For one, it attacks the knight on e3, and it also threatens mate on h2. So the only possible move here is moving the rook. Queen takes, king moves to f1, and queen to h1 is checkmate. And so now, in this game, you learned many things. For one, you learned that sometimes passive moves are preferred, such as here. The king side needs protection. Although bishop to e2 looks rather passive, it is really the only way to stop most of those threats. Also, before you castle, you should always think, is it safe to castle? Right here, no it's not. There's no pieces on the king side. White should either wait until he has all his pieces developed, wait to see what black is doing, and if it's safe, he can always castle queenside, because he has 3 pawns still intact, and if it's safe, it's not bad to castle queenside. They say castling kingside is preferred, however, it's not always true. There are certain positions where you should wait and castle queenside, or just not even castle at all. Especially in this position, white should wait, or wait and castle queenside, because after castling, the attack just rages on. And also, to force a permanent weakness, you need to have something like a mate threat, like this. Force a pawn push in front of a king. If your opponent is not going to provide you with a target, such as playing h3 here, then you need to force him to weaken his king, because he won't do it voluntarily. So after bishop to d6 here, the king is forced to become weaker, and g3 has to be played, and now black just penetrates white's position and wins the game. Right, now we're going to look at yet another game focusing on the theme of making your opponent make a weakness. So, d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop to g5, bishop e7, e3, castles kingside, knight f3, b6, bishop to d3, bishop b7, c takes d5, e takes, knight to e5, putting the knight in the center, knight b to d7, and now f4, fighting for the center, supporting the knight, and also opening up the f-file for the rook. And now, c5. So if black would have chosen the alternative, knight takes knight, then the f-pawn takes e5, now the black knight has to move away, and the kingside suddenly becomes bare of any pieces. So instead, c5 was played, fighting for the center. Now, castles. Not just to protect the king, but also to put the rook on a file that is bound to become open. So now, c4. So you have to remember that you need to keep the pressure on the center. By moving it to c4, the pressure is off, and now white does not have to worry about the center. So you have to remember, keep the option of recapturing the central pawns, so you can keep the pressure high in the center. With this move, white just simply moves to c2. And black's whole intention of playing c4 was to keep the majority on the queen side and go for an attack, as you'll see. However, white just ignores it all, because he is too busy fighting on the king side, which black does not see. So a6 preparing b5, now queen to f3, and white does not care about that queenside attack. b5, and now queen to h3, again with the theme, if your opponent won't voluntarily make a weakness, make him make a weakness. Now a pawn has to move, and now the king is suddenly weaker. So, here, white pushes to f5, trying to open up the f-file and attack the pawn to open up the king side. So black, of course, is not going to take it, because that gets the rook into the game and weakens the king a great amount. So now b4 going for the knight. So now f takes g6. It doesn't really threaten mate right away, however it opens up the king. And now the knight is over here hanging. So what does black do? Well, first he takes. So there are a few options. If you take the knight first, bishop takes knight, knight takes, now the rook can take, and now you can't take it back or it's mate, so the f-pawn takes, bishop takes pawn, h takes, and then rook takes g6 is mate. How about if the f-pawn takes, queen to e6 check, king h8, knight takes d7, knight takes d7, rook takes, knight takes, queen check, and then king to g8, bishop takes e7, and white is won. It's very easy to win now. So now you conclude that h takes is the only safe option. So now you have queen to h4, putting another attacker on the knight. And now black takes the knight. However, this knight is unimportant right now. It's not doing anything towards the king side. Black has to focus more on the king side. However, there's not really anything else to do. Black doesn't want to take this knight, or else the pawn comes in, and then black is losing a bishop. So he takes the knight, now knight takes d7, and then queen takes, and now one of the defenders of the f6 knight has been removed. So now, rook takes f6. So this is actually much stronger than bishop takes f6, because after rook takes, of course, black is not going to take it back, because otherwise bishop takes f6, and the checkmate on h8 is inevitable. Next move, it's coming. So instead, in this position, he doesn't take, he plays a5. He's getting ready to play rook to a6 and try to defend the king side. It's his last hope. So he moves his rook to f1, rook to a6, bishop takes g6, taking out the last of the kingside pawns, f takes, and now Pillsbury, who was playing white, showed that there was a forced mate in 7 moves after rook takes f8, bishop takes, rook takes, king takes, queen h8 check, king f7, queen to h7 check, and now king to f8, and if, instead, king to e8, queen to g8 is checkmate, if instead king to e6, queen takes g6 is checkmate, so now king to f8, forcing him to abandon the queen, so queen takes queen, bishop to c6, bishop h6 check, king to g8, and there is checkmate. So this game was a perfect example of the fact that you have to pay attention on what your opponent is doing. Is he going to do something? Why would your opponent play queen to f3? Why would you play then b5? You need to look. Make sure he's not trying to do something to you. Because in this position, he wants to play queen to h3, forcing the weakness, while black is on the queen side making an attack. He's not focused enough on the king side to stop anything. So remember, if your opponent is not going to make a weakness, make him make a weakness. To be our last game of this lesson, and it is actually one of my favorite games just because of the way that white has this huge king side attack, especially with his 2 knights. He aims everything at black's king, and he just destroys black in only 17 moves. So let's take a look. e4, e6, the French defense, and then d2. So a lot of people ask me, why not knight to c3? It looks much better. Well, in the French, c5 is normally a big idea. And so, white wants to be able to stop that move with c3. Also, after the bishop moves to b4, if the knight's on c3, it's a good move. It pins the knight. However, now, c3 can just get out of the pin right away and gain a tempo. So knight to f6, e5, knight back to d7, bishop to d3, aiming his first piece right at the king side. Not at the king yet. So let's see how black gets into the trouble. So c5, c3, knight to c6, and now knight to e2. Probably the best idea here. So you might think, shouldn't the knight belong on f3? And you're right. A knight should go to f3, because it's the perfect square for the knight in this position. However, if you look at this d2 knight, it can also move to f3, and it releases the bishop while doing so. So instead of moving this knight to d3, or f3, sorry, he's going to move this knight up to f3. And now he's going to release the bishop, and the knight on e2 has a future up on f4 to attack e6, stopping any possibility of black playing f6. So now this just proves that white is not playing mechanical chess. Because if you're playing mechanical chess, you're thinking, A knight belongs on f3. I'm going to place my knight on f3 because that's where it belongs. Instead, white is looking deeper in the position and noticing that after black moves, like queen to b6 in the game, he can swing his d knight up to f3 and put this knight on e2 up to f4. So now bishop to e7, castles, and castles. And now we see the complete opposite of white. Black is playing mechanical chess. He just missed a chance to play f6 and try to take out the pawn structure. In fact, if he does not play f6, he's going to be cramped up for the rest of the game, not be able to do anything with his pieces, and he's not going to be able to get anywhere in the game, allowing white to develop and get this a big attack. So that's mechanical chess. Knowing that you have to castle, and castling because you were told to castle, instead of looking deeper, what can I do to improve my position? So now, after that, knight to f4, just as white planned, and now it stops any threat of f6. And black looks at the position and realizes that he needs to play f6, otherwise nothing's going to go anywhere. So he plays knight to d8, protecting e6, allowing f6 to be played. And now, white stops any idea of f6 with queen to c2. And just like all the other games, if your opponent is not going to voluntarily make a weakness, you have to make the weakness yourself. And now he has to protect against the threat of bishop takes h7. So he's going to have to move a pawn. You already kicked away one of the important knights from f6 over to d7, so now the king side is pretty much bare of any possible defenders. So now he has to move a pawn, and he moves f5. Now, any other move actually decreases the chance of black to be able to play f6. Black wants to move that f-pawn, and he knows for a fact that white is probably going to take it en passant. So, white does, and now black should be happy. He's way more relaxed, and things are just going his way now. He's getting his pieces out, however, he missed something. Knight to g5. One more attacker on h6 or h7, and now a pawn has to move. So let's just say that the h-pawn moves. Now bishop to h7, king to h8, and knight to g6 mates. And just look at how beautiful these knights are placed. So instead, he has to move g6, creating two holes, one on f6 and one on h6. So now, white follows up with bishop takes g6, ripping open the king side. And now, because of these two knights are what allows it to be possible. So here, black is pretty much forced to take, because otherwise his position falls apart, like after h6, for example. Bishop h7 check, king to g7, queen to g6, king to h8, queen takes h6, and now black has to defend against the mate threats, especially knight to g6 checkmate, and he also has to watch out for this deadly discovered check of moving the bishop away. So that's not good. So black realizes that he probably has to take. However, after pawn takes, the queen invades into enemy territory, queen takes g6 check, king to h8, queen to h6 check to clear room for the knight, king to g8, and now knight to g6, and there are two mate threats on the board. And so now, black is over. It's the game over. Nothing else to happen. Because there's a mate threat, knight takes e7, checkmate, and queen to h8, checkmate. And if black moves this f6 knight, it's checkmate on h7. And there's no way that he can defend against both of those checkmates.